Welcome to the debate.
Our discussion today centers on the global copper supply market. Specifically, we're looking at an analysis that frames the dynamic between three major players, Chile, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, as a kind of copper tug-of-war.
Right, and the central question we're tackling is this. Is that metaphor, this idea of a zero-sum, three-way rivalry, really the most accurate way to grasp what's happening in global copper supply? Or, well, does it maybe oversimplify things a bit too much?
Exactly. So I'll be taking the position that the tug-of-war metaphor, while maybe catchy, actually captures the main tension, the key friction points in the current supply landscape. It puts the focus right where it should be, on these three absolutely crucial but quite different exporters.
And I'll be arguing that, look, while these three nations are undoubtedly critical, framing the entire global copper competition as just a direct tug-of-war between only them ignores some vital differences, maybe even complementary roles, and certainly the huge influence of big consumer nations. I think it ends up being a bit reductive.
Okay, let me lay out my position first then. The rivalry we're talking about, I believe, is fundamentally defined by the shifting dominance among these three specific geopolitical players. They almost represent different eras of copper production, don't they?
In what way?
Oh, well, Chile is the established giant, characterized by these huge, mature mining operations. But now they're battling, frankly, declining ore grades and increasing pressure around social license to operate. Then you have the DRC in Indonesia. They're the volatile, rapidly emerging future. The DRC has its incredibly high-grade copper-cobalt belt, but also, significant risk. And Indonesia is aggressively pushing resource nationalism, demanding domestic processing.
Okay.
So this concentration of fundamentally different archetypes, the mature versus the emerging, makes their direct competition the main story, especially if you're tracking long-term supply forecasts. When we talk about who's going to gain future market share in copper, we are, I think, necessarily talking about which of these two emerging players, the DRC or Indonesia, can really step up as Chile faces its structural slowdown.
Right, I see the logic there. And I absolutely acknowledge the immense significance of Chile, Indonesia, and the DRC. They definitely set global production benchmarks. But the whole premise of a tug-of-war, doesn't that suggest a kind of symmetrical battle where, gains by one directly mean losses for another? That feels like a big analytical leap to me.
Well,
because true global competition involves, dozens of factors beyond just who's digging up the most ore, right? To really understand the market, we have to bring in things like demand elasticity in consumer countries, technological shifts maybe leading to substitution, and critically, the industrial policies happening in places like China or the US that really dictate future demand for things like infrastructure. So conflating the entire global copper competition with just a rivalry between these three, I still think it oversimplifies the real systemic forces. If the copper market gets tight, it's not just three countries pulling a rope. It's more like a global stress test involving finance, policy, everything. It determines who pays more and who potentially goes without.
Okay, let's tackle that metaphor, the tug-of-war, head-on then. I actually defend it precisely because it highlights the immediate and I think zero-sum nature of competition for two incredibly scarce resources right now: locking in long-term supply contracts and, crucially, attracting scarce long-term mining capital.
Capital, okay.
Yeah. Capital markets, when they look at allocating billions for new mine development, they see it as a direct win-or-lose contest for the title of future dominant supplier. Think about it. If a major consumer signs a huge long-term deal, locking up output from a massive new project in the DRC, something that took, say, a decade and billions to build, well, that volume is effectively off the table for others, and that capital has been committed. That specific deal isn't available for Chilean expansion projects or for building Indonesian smelters, at least not in the medium term. In that high-stakes capital competition, these three nations are, I argue, the primary competing destinations.
I completely get why securing capital feels zero-sum. I really do. But the tug-of-war metaphor, I think, starts to break down pretty dramatically when you look closer at what these countries are actually selling. They're not offering identical products on identical terms. A tug-of-war implies direct, symmetrical opposition over the same finite pool. But copper isn't monolithic.
Go on.
Well, consider the technical side. Chile's output is largely refined cathode, right? A finished, easily traded product. Indonesia, increasingly, because of its nationalist policies, wants to export only processed metal or maybe high-value, semi-finished goods. The DRC, though, often exports high-grade copper concentrate. That's an intermediate product needing specialized refining, usually somewhere else, often in Asia.
Okay.
So, because concentrates involve complex logistics, blending, specific refining capacity needs, it essentially segments the buyer pool. The competition isn't purely adversarial. The market structure often means these nations play complementary roles, serving different buyer needs based on their downstream capacity, rather than just being direct rivals pulling against each other.
That point about product type is interesting, definitely compelling, but doesn't it risk kind of blurring the focus? I mean, yes, the final product might differ, but the underlying competition is still for investor confidence and market belief and reliable delivery. Investors ultimately maybe care less if it's cathode or concentrate and more about policy stability and their expected returns. The friction that the source material points to and what makes the tug-of-war idea useful, I think, is the competition for that exponential growth capital. Chile offers political stability, sure, despite its falling grades. The DRC offers world-beating grades, but, let's face it, extreme risk. Indonesia offers policy certainty, but only if you play by its nationalist rules. The zero-sum part here is, where does the next $10 billion investment in a major new greenfield site actually go? That decision, hinging almost entirely on assessing policy risk between these three, feels inherently zero-sum to me.
Okay, but if the focus is purely on competing for capital, why does the analysis isolate only these three? This, for me, brings up the biggest limitation of this whole framework, leaving out other major players. I mean, has the analysis considered how excluding, say, Peru, which is globally vital, or Australia, a key source of stable concentrate supply, fundamentally narrows the scope of what we mean by global copper competition?
What?
And beyond that, why exclude the strategic decisions of consumer nations? A sudden big stock build by China, for example, or a major green infrastructure bill in the US, these things can influence the global price and supply expectations far more dramatically sometimes than a policy shift in Jakarta or a mining dispute in Katanga. Isn't the real tug-of-war ultimately between overall supply and overall demand rather than just three suppliers fighting each other?
I absolutely recognize the influence of Peru and Australia, of course. But the reason I believe the analysis focuses on this specific trio is that the type of tension they generate is fundamentally different. It's about exponential risk and potential structural transformation, not just incremental, predictable supply changes.
Explain that distinction more.
Peru and Australia, generally speaking, represent stable, mature, predictable supply increments. Their policies, their production levels, they rarely shock the entire system. In contrast, the critical tension driving immediate supply shocks and shaping those long-term capital flows is rooted in the unpredictable dynamics of, say, Chile's aging infrastructure versus Indonesia's aggressive nationalization versus the DRC's geopolitical volatility. These three nations together represent the primary axis of potential instability and step change in supply. The source focuses on them because their shifts, whether regulatory, geopolitical, or even geological, tend to exert a disproportionate and immediate influence on global benchmarks compared to the steadier changes elsewhere. They are the market movers, and that volatile movement is what the tug-of-war tries to capture, however imperfectly.
Okay, that distinction between incremental stability and exponential risk is actually a very helpful clarification of your point. I appreciate that. However, if the framework is really meant to analyze risk, then I'd argue the tug-of-war metaphor again proved a bit too simplistic. The core tension we're seeing, especially in the DRC and Indonesia, isn't just straightforward competition. It's often resource nationalism, which can manifest as, contractual instability or sudden policy mandates that come out of left field.
Like Indonesia's smelting mandate?
Exactly. Like Indonesia's smelting mandate, that's a perfect example. The real insight there isn't just that Indonesia is competing harder. It's that they've strategically shifted the entire battlefield. They're not just competing on raw volume anymore. They're demanding domestic value add. This makes them a direct competitor not just to Chilean mines, but to Asian refiners, to downstream processors, forcing capital to be deployed locally within Indonesia. This policy-driven shift fundamentally separates them from a simple adversarial rivalry implied by pulling on a rope. Their actions don't just potentially take market share from Chile, they aim to fundamentally alter the global copper processing chain itself. That complexity isn't a simple tug. It's a structural realignment driven by internal policy goals.
I agree, Indonesia's actions are structural, they're profound. But I'd argue that tug-of-war metaphor implicitly includes this very competition for value addition and capital placement. They are still competing intensely to attract the specific type of capital needed for future development, whether that's upstream mining or downstream processing. Look at the choices. Chile offers relative institutional stability, but with growing environmental hurdles. The DRC offers incredible grade, but extreme governance risk. Indonesia demands local control, but offers maybe a long-term sovereign partnership if you comply. The contest is about who can best manage this complex policy trade-off to win that capital. And the zero-sum element remains. If a major company builds a massive smelter in Indonesia, they are far, far less likely to build comparable capacity elsewhere, like Chile, anytime soon. That capital is spent. The strategic decision is made.
But isn't that decision to invest in an Indonesian smelter potentially driven more by policy compliance, needing to build it there to access the resource at all, rather than a pure competitive victory over, say, a Chilean mine site based on economics alone? The framework feels too blunt to capture those nuanced policy drivers. Comparing these three as just opposing forces on a rope ignores the unique internal hurdles each faces. Things that might cause multi-year production delays totally unrelated to what their competitors are doing, like internal political chaos or a breakdown in resource governance. The metaphor implies a competitive failure when sometimes the failure to deliver copper is actually internal and structural. It risks confusing adversarial competition with simply parallel vulnerability to different kinds of risk.
We should probably also circle back to the volume question tied to risk. You brought up Peru. Yes, Peru is stable and huge, but its supply is also highly geographically concentrated, right? That makes it vulnerable to localized disruptions, social unrest, or even natural events. Chile, while vast, is grappling with that secular decline in ore grades, needing immense capital just to maintain current levels. The DRC and Indonesia, for all their volatility, possess the geological reserves capable of delivering potentially massive, disruptive new volumes onto the market. And that dynamic, the ability of the DRC and Indonesia to potentially increase supply exponentially, perhaps at the expense of capital that might have otherwise gone to just maintain or marginally expand in Chile, that is the fundamental friction point that I think defines this tug-of-war.
That's a sophisticated defense, linking the risk directly to capital displacement. Fair enough. But let me push on the technical or maybe market structure side one last time. If, as most analysts project, we need all three, and probably more, to meet massive future copper demand, perhaps driven by the energy transition, then isn't the competition fundamentally not zero-sum in the long run? Isn't it additive? We're potentially facing a huge supply deficit by, say, 2030. In a deficit environment, the competition seems less about stealing existing market share and more about who can actually get their product to market first and most reliably. That sounds less like a static tug-of-war for a fixed pie and more like a kind of relay race, driven by internal execution capability and governance efficiency. The key determinant becomes internal project velocity, which the metaphor of purely external opposition completely misses.
I'd argue that the relay race analogy might be strong for describing potential production capacity over the long term, sure. But the tug-of-war works better as an analogy for the perception of risk held by strategic investors and governments right now, in the shorter term. Copper supply in the immediate sense is pretty inelastic. If Chile suffers a sudden policy shock or the DRC faces a serious security incident, the market reacts almost instantly, as if that lost capacity directly benefits the other two. You see it in short-term contract reallocations, in price spikes. The market's immediate reaction often treats the scenario as zero-sum because supply is fungible and the immediately available volume is finite. So the metaphor for me captures that crucial psychological market friction, even if the underlying long-term structure is admittedly more complex.
So, to wrap up my argument, while the copper market is undeniably complex, and we've certainly explored the nuances of grade, product type, policy, risk, I still believe the source material correctly identifies the core nexus of current global supply competition in this distinct, volatile rivalry between Chile, Indonesia, and the DRC. They embody the past, the uncertain present, and the potential future of copper production. The tug-of-war, therefore, remains a useful, if simplified, strategic shorthand for understanding where the greatest market friction, the most intense capital competition, and the most significant geopolitical risk originates, especially for immediate investment decisions.
And from my perspective, while reaffirming the absolutely critical importance of these three nations, particularly in shaping the market's future risk profile, I have to maintain that the tug-of-war framing ultimately limits our ability to strategically engage with the full picture of the global copper competition. We really need to look beyond a simple three-way contest to truly appreciate the dynamics. That means analyzing broader structural factors, like demand elasticity, the critical role of secondary producers we discussed, and maybe even the influence of scrap markets. By over-focusing on just the rivalry aspect, we risk, for example, misinterpreting internal governance failures within one country as purely a competitive setback relative to the others. The metaphor, while memorable, might inadvertently guide strategic thinking down too narrow a path.
Indeed. And perhaps examining the utility and the limitations of different analytical frames, whether it's a simple metaphor like the tug-of-war or a more complex structural model, is crucial in itself. It helps deepen our understanding of these incredibly complex and absolutely critical global commodity markets. Understanding how we frame the competition inevitably shapes where we decide to place capital and how we manage risk going forward.